Have you ever felt that sudden rush, like a storm breaking inside your chest? Your heart races, your breath shortens, words sharpen in your throat, ready to cut. It all happens in a split second. That's anger. And though it burns brightly for only a moment, its ashes can remain for a lifetime. There's an old saying, one moment of anger, 1,000 moments of regret. It's not just poetry, it's truth. Ask anyone who has lost a friend, a family member, or even their life's opportunity in a single flash of temper, and you'll hear the same story. I wish I could take it back. But anger doesn't wait for permission. It rises uninvited, hijacking the mind, blinding our better judgment. And in its wake, it leaves behind broken pieces, pieces of relationships, trust, and even ourselves. Imagine a father, exhausted after a long day at work. His child runs to him with excitement, spilling juice on his shirt. Without thinking, the father explodes, scolding, yelling, his voice louder than his love. The child retreats, not understanding why joy turned into fear. Hours later, when the anger cools, regret enters. He wishes he had smiled, wiped the spill, embraced the child. But time doesn't rewind. That one moment of fire has already burned into memory. Or think of a workplace where a single angry outburst ruins years of cooperation. A word spoken in rage can't be swallowed back. It lingers in the air, echoing longer than silence ever could. We've all been there. Each of us has felt the sting of regret after anger, sometimes as light as a sigh, sometimes as heavy as a burden carried for years. Buddhism speaks of anger not as an enemy outside us, but as a fire within. In the teachings of the Buddha, anger belongs to the three poisons: greed, hatred, and ignorance. These poisons don't just harm the world, they corrode the heart, clouding wisdom, planting seeds of suffering. But anger is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's the cold silence we give to someone we love. Sometimes it's the grudge we water like a secret garden. And still, its roots grow deep and the fruit is always bitter. Why then do we speak of anger? Because to understand it is to understand ourselves. Because the fire we fear is the fire we carry. Science, too, echoes what the Buddha taught centuries ago. Neuroscience tells us that anger floods the brain with chemicals designed for survival. Adrenaline, cortisol, the fight or flight response. Useful when facing a wild animal, dangerous when facing another human being. In those heated moments, reason is drowned out, empathy fades, and impulse takes the wheel. The Buddha compared anger to holding a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. Who gets burned first? The one holding it. And yet, even knowing this, why do we still let anger rule us? Why do we hold on to the coal? Perhaps because anger feels powerful, like we're finally in control. But the truth is, in anger we are least in control. It is not strength, but weakness disguised as force. Let us pause here and reflect. Think of the last time you were angry. What happened? Did it bring peace or did it leave you restless? Did it build bridges or did it break them? Anger rarely leaves us proud. More often, it leaves us whispering, "I wish I had stayed silent. I wish I had chosen differently." This is why we must look deeper, not to condemn anger, but to understand it. Not to deny it, but to see it clearly, because only through seeing can we transform. There's a story told in Buddhist tradition. Once a monk was insulted in front of many people. Harsh words were thrown at him, words sharp enough to wound pride and ignite rage. But the monk remained calm, his eyes soft, his breath steady. Later, when asked why he didn't respond, he smiled and said, "If someone offers you a gift and you refuse it, who does the gift belong to?" The answer is clear. It remains with the giver. So too with anger. If you don't accept it, it returns to the one who offered it. That story holds a mirror for us. How often do we accept the gift of anger only to poison ourselves with it? How often do we trade peace for pain? This journey we are about to take is not just about learning how to control anger. It is about uncovering its nature, its cost, and its hidden lessons. It is about discovering that while anger can destroy in a second, compassion can heal for a lifetime. Because just as one moment of anger can lead to countless regrets, One moment of patience can lead to countless blessings. So let us walk deeper into the heart of this fire, not to be consumed by it, but to understand it. And in understanding, perhaps, we will find the path to extinguishing it. The fire we spoke of, anger, doesn't only burn in the moment, it seeps deeper. It poisons the well of the mind. In Buddhism, anger is not seen as a passing mood, but as one of the three poisons: greed, hatred, and ignorance. These are the roots of suffering, the forces that keep us trapped in the endless cycle of dissatisfaction. Anger, in particular, is like venom coursing through the veins of the heart. When we become angry, clarity vanishes. The mind that could once see clearly becomes clouded, distorted. What was small feels enormous. What was accidental feels intentional. What was forgivable suddenly feels unbearable. Anger does not show us the truth of the situation. It shows us a twisted version painted in fire. Imagine looking into a mirror covered in smoke. You no longer see your own reflection. That's what anger does to perception. It blinds us, not only to others, but to ourselves. The Buddha compared anger to darkness. When it arises, wisdom disappears. Even a wise person, when consumed by anger, may speak or act in ways they would never imagine in calmer moments. And afterward, when the fire fades, regret appears, because deep down, the heart knows those words were not truth, but poison. Science echoes this. Neuroscientists have found that when anger surges, the brain's amygdala, the center of fear and aggression, takes over. Blood flows away from the areas responsible for logic and decision-making. The result? We literally lose access to reason. It's not that we don't want to think clearly, it's that the brain won't let us. This is why anger feels like being hijacked, because it is. And yet, anger often disguises itself as strength. People shout to prove they are in control. They slam doors, raise fists, or speak cruel words, believing it shows power. But what kind of strength is it that collapses the moment calmness is restored? What kind of power is it that leaves us ashamed afterward? True strength is not in raising the voice, it is in steadying the heart. The Buddha once told his disciples, "Hatred is never appeased by hatred. By love alone is hatred appeased." This is an eternal law. Here lies the essence of why anger is poison. When anger meets anger, it multiplies. It spreads like fire leaping from branch to branch, consuming everything in its path. Wars have begun this way. Families have shattered this way. Generations have carried wounds born from a single spark of hatred. But when anger meets compassion, the fire finds no fuel. It burns out. It cannot survive in the face of understanding. Let's turn to a simple story. A farmer once discovered that his neighbor's cow had wandered into his field, destroying part of his crops. Furious, he stormed into his neighbor's home, shouting accusations. But before he could finish, the neighbor bowed his head and said, "I am truly sorry. I should have been more careful. Please let me repay the damage." The farmer's anger melted instantly. Why? Because the fire of his rage had no fuel to continue. His neighbor had met anger with humility, not with resistance. This story may sound simple, but in it lies a profound truth. Anger cannot survive when faced with wisdom and compassion. Still, many of us cling to anger as if it were a shield protecting us. But in reality, anger is not protection. It is self-destruction. Holding on to anger is like holding a burning torch in our bare hands. We think it lights our path, but in truth, it is scorching us from within. Even when we don't lash out, suppressed anger eats at the mind. Resentment builds walls around the heart. Silent grudges age us faster than time itself. The body reflects what the mind carries: tension in the chest, knots in the stomach, exhaustion that no sleep can cure. Anger doesn't only poison the mind, it poisons the body too. But here is something worth noticing. Anger is never born alone. It arises with its shadow, ignorance. We mistake temporary emotions for truth. We mistake assumptions for reality. Someone doesn't return a call and the mind whispers, "They don't respect you." Someone frowns and we imagine, "They must hate me." In that ignorance, anger is born. And once born, it demands to be fed through arguments, revenge, or silent resentment. This is why anger is not simply an emotion. It is a cycle, a self-feeding loop that once started rarely ends on its own. Unless we see it clearly, we are caught inside it. But here is the good news. Because anger is a mental state, it is not permanent. It arises, it fades. It can be transformed. The Buddha did not teach us to suppress anger or to pretend it doesn't exist. He taught us to see it as it is, a poison that loses power the moment we recognize its nature. When we say anger is a poison, we are not condemning ourselves for feeling it. We are simply naming it for what it is, so that we may find the antidote. And that antidote begins with awareness. Think of anger like a spark in dry grass. If we notice it early, a single breath can extinguish it. But if ignored, it spreads into a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. This is why the first step is not to fight anger, but to watch it. To see the rising heat in the chest, the tension in the jaw, the racing of thoughts. To say silently, this is anger, this is poison, this is not who I am. In that moment of awareness, the poison begins to weaken. The fire loses its grip. Anger is a poison to the mind, yes, but poisons can be studied, understood, and cured. And the cure, as we shall see, is not outside us, it is already within. The challenge is not to eliminate anger overnight, but to learn to recognize it, to understand its nature, and to transform its energy into something greater. Because the same fire that destroys can also give warmth when tended with care. And so, our journey continues, not only to see the scars anger leaves behind, but to understand why regret follows so faithfully in its shadow. When the fire of anger fades, what remains? Silence, emptiness, and often regret. It's almost cruel how swiftly the storm passes. In the heat of the moment, anger feels justified, necessary even. We convince ourselves, I had to say it, I had to react. But once the flames settle, once the adrenaline leaves our veins, clarity returns like morning after a night of thunder. And with clarity comes the shadow of regret. Why does it hurt so deeply? Because anger blinds us only for a moment, but the consequences of that blindness can echo for years. Think of the words spoken in rage. A son telling his mother, I wish you weren't my parent. A friend yelling, I never want to see you again. A lover shouting, you mean nothing to me. The moment passes, but those words, though untrue, lodge themselves in memory. Long after the anger fades, the wounds remain. People may forgive, but they rarely forget. And so regret follows us, whispering, if only I had stayed silent, if only I had breathed before I spoke. In Buddhist thought, this regret is more than emotion. It is karma, the imprint left behind by unwholesome action. Anger plants seeds. Words are like arrows, once released they cannot return to the bow. Actions are like stones cast into water, ripples spread far beyond what the eye can see. Sometimes the regret is small, a conversation spoiled, a day ruined, but sometimes one burst of anger changes an entire life. Let me tell you a story. A young merchant once lived in a bustling town. He was hardworking, kind, respected by all. But one evening, exhausted and irritable, he returned home to find that his servant had broken a valuable jar of oil. Furious, the merchant struck the boy. The blow was too hard, the boy collapsed and never rose again. In that single instant, the merchant's life shattered. His reputation vanished, his wealth meant nothing, and his conscience became his prison. Every night, he saw the boy's face in his dreams. What began as one moment of anger became a lifetime of regret. This story, though ancient, carries a truth we all know. Anger destroys faster than we can rebuild. And regret lingers like a shadow that refuses to leave. Psychologists today tell us that regret is one of the heaviest human emotions. It's not just about wishing the past were different. It's about knowing we caused the pain, that we could have chosen otherwise. This self-awareness is both a gift and a torment. A gift because it pushes us to grow. A torment because it reminds us of what cannot be undone. And so anger is doubly cruel. It harms others in the moment, and it harms ourselves in the aftermath. First we burn them, then we burn inside. But here's the deeper wound. Anger steals more than peace. It steals time. Hours, days, even years can be consumed by replaying that one moment in the mind. Why did I say that? Why did I do that? What if I had chosen differently? Life is short, yet anger stretches its consequences across decades. One rash act can cut off relationships that took a lifetime to build. And when we look back, regret is often not about what was done to us, but what we did to others in anger. The Buddha once said, "An angry person is ugly. He sleeps poorly. He loses strength. He harms himself and others. He brings misfortune, and when he dies, he is reborn in suffering." Strong words, but they reflect a deep truth. Anger doesn't just scar the present, it shapes the future. The regret we carry becomes heavy baggage, weighing down the journey of our life and perhaps beyond. Yet in regret, there is also opportunity. To regret is to awaken. To regret is to recognize that the path we walked was wrong and to seek another way. Regret shows us what anger hides, that compassion, patience, and silence are worth more than the sharpest reply. The shadow of regret can be a teacher if we are willing to listen. Still, let us not romanticize regret. It is not sweet, it is bitter. It reminds us that every choice carries weight, and in this awareness we find caution, humility, and the motivation to guard the heart before anger takes root. Because once anger strikes, it is too late. The arrow is gone, the wound is made, and though healing is possible, scars remain. Think for a moment, what is your deepest regret? Does it come from anger or from patience, from harsh words or from silence? Most of us find the answer is clear. No one lies awake at night regretting kindness, but countless hearts lie restless, haunted by words and deeds born of fury. This is why regret is anger's shadow. They travel together. One moment of rage, 1,000 moments of sorrow. But shadows need light to exist. And light in this path is wisdom. Wisdom teaches us that if regret is the echo of anger, then compassion can be the song that drowns it out. We cannot erase the past, but we can shape the future. We can choose patience over fury, kindness over cruelty, silence over destruction. And in making that choice, we not only free others from pain, we free ourselves from the shadow that lingers so heavily, regret. The Buddha understood anger more deeply than any philosopher, king, or sage of his time. To him, anger was not just an emotion, it was a chain that binds us to suffering, pulling us further away from peace. In the scriptures, anger is called dosa, a state of mind poisoned by aversion, hostility, and hatred. And the Buddha warned, as long as anger lives in the heart, freedom cannot be found. One of his most famous teachings comes from the Dhammapada. Victory breeds hatred. The defeated live in pain. Happily the peaceful live, giving up both victory and defeat. In other words, even when we win through anger, shouting louder, striking harder, proving ourselves right, we do not truly win. Because in the process, we plant seeds of hatred both in ourselves and in others. The victory is empty and the cost is heavy. There is a story of the Buddha himself, walking calmly one day when a man approached him in fury. The man shouted insults, cursed his name, and tried every word to wound. But the Buddha stood silent, his eyes soft, his breath steady. Finally, when the man had exhausted himself, the Buddha spoke gently. "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man, surprised, answered, "It remains with the giver." The Buddha smiled. "Just so, I do not accept your anger. It remains with you." The lesson is timeless. Anger offered does not need to be anger received. We always have a choice. Another time, the Buddha compared anger to holding a red-hot coal, intending to throw it at someone else. Who gets burned first? The one holding it. This is the essence of his teaching. Anger does not punish our enemies, it punishes us. It burns the heart, poisons the mind, clouds our wisdom, and destroys our own peace long before it touches another. But the Buddha was not naive. He knew we cannot simply wish anger away. To overcome it, we must train the mind, and so he offered powerful antidotes. The first is loving kindness, or metta. When anger arises, instead of fueling it with hostile thoughts, the Buddha urged us to cultivate kindness, to silently wish, "May this person be well, may they be free from suffering, may they find peace." At first, it feels impossible. Why send goodwill to someone who has hurt us? But over time, loving kindness softens the edges of the heart. It doesn't excuse wrong behavior. It simply prevents us from carrying their poison inside ourselves. The second antidote is patience, or khanti. The Buddha praised patience as one of the highest virtues. He said, "Enduring patience is the highest austerity. Nibbana is supreme, say the Buddhas. He is not a recluse who harms another. He is not an ascetic who oppresses others." Patience is not weakness. It is strength greater than anger because it requires mastery over oneself. To lash out takes no effort. To remain calm requires immense courage. The third antidote is wisdom, or panyanya. Anger thrives on ignorance. We think we are enemies, but in truth, all beings suffer and seek happiness. To see the interconnectedness of life is to see that harming another is ultimately harming ourselves. The Buddha taught that when someone wrongs us, it is often because they are blinded by their own pain, their own ignorance. Responding with anger only deepens their blindness. Responding with compassion offers a chance for healing. In one discourse, the Buddha gave this radical advice. Even if bandits were to carve you up limb by limb with a saw, he who gave rise to anger would not be following my teaching. Extreme as it sounds, the message is clear. Anger, no matter how justified it feels, leads only to suffering. Freedom lies not in reacting, but in refusing to let anger take root. But let us be honest, these teachings are not easy. To remain calm when insulted, to forgive when harmed, to love when hated, this feels like walking against the current of human instinct. And yet, that is precisely the path of awakening. To go beyond instinct, beyond reaction, into the vast space of wisdom and compassion. The Buddha did not teach us to be doormats, nor to suppress our emotions. He taught us to see anger clearly, to let it rise and fall without acting upon it. In mindfulness, we discover freedom. So why do the Buddha's teachings on anger matter today? Because the world is still burning. Nations rage against nations. Families divide over words. Strangers on the street explode in fury over the smallest offenses. The fire of anger is not ancient. It is alive here and now. And if we do not learn the way of patience, compassion, and wisdom, the shadow of regret will continue to follow humanity, just as it follows each of us. But where the Buddha's wisdom shines is in showing that anger is not destiny. It is habit, and habits can be broken. Through mindfulness, through compassion, through practice, we can free ourselves from its grip. Imagine a life where words spoken are never regretted, where no outburst haunts us at night, where every challenge is met not with fire but with clarity. This is the life the Buddha pointed to, a life beyond the poison of anger. Anger doesn't ask for much. It doesn't need an hour or even a minute. Sometimes just a heartbeat is enough. One sharp word, one rash decision, one outburst that feels so small in the moment, yet its weight can be carried for a lifetime. This is the cruel economy of anger. It demands little to ignite, but it costs everything when it burns. Think of the relationships broken in a single instant. A father in a flash of rage slaps his son. The boy's tears dry, but the memory remains etched deep, a reminder that love can turn into violence without warning. Years later, the son still flinches when voices rise. Or consider the spouse who, in frustration, shouts words that can never be taken back. "I don't love you anymore." Perhaps they didn't mean it. Perhaps it was the heat of anger speaking. But the wound is there, and trust, once cracked, is never the same. This is the cost. Broken bonds, fractured hearts, love turned fragile. And it doesn't stop at family. Anger destroys friendships too. A single heated argument, a harsh accusation, and suddenly years of shared laughter are overshadowed by one night of shouting. In workplaces, anger can erase reputations in seconds. A leader who loses their temper before employees may lose not just their respect, but their authority. One email sent in rage, one meeting outburst, and entire careers collapse. History is full of leaders, kings, and generals who made decisions in anger and brought ruin not just upon themselves, but upon entire nations. There is a story from the Buddhist texts about a king known for his temper. One day, a servant made a small mistake, something trivial, forgettable. But the king's fury erupted like a storm. In his rage, he ordered the servant executed. When the anger passed, the king was filled with horror at what he had done. But regret could not bring the servant back. The cost of his outburst was irreversible. His kingdom whispered of his cruelty, his people feared him, and his conscience tortured him until his final days. The lesson is timeless. Anger demands payment far greater than the moment it occupies. But the cost of anger is not only in relationships or reputation. It is also in the body, in the heart, in the spirit. When we explode in fury, our bodies flood with stress hormones. Blood pressure rises, the heart races, muscles tense. Over time, repeated anger erodes health, damaging the heart, weakening the immune system, shortening the span of life. Doctors today confirm what the Buddha taught long ago. Anger harms the one who carries it far more than the one at whom it is directed. And then there is the spiritual cost. In Buddhist thought, every action plants a seed. When anger controls us, we plant seeds of suffering. One outburst may seem small, but in the law of karma, even a moment shapes the future. A cruel word can return as loneliness. A violent act can return as pain. A single moment of uncontrolled rage can create lifetimes of sorrow. But perhaps the heaviest cost of all is not what we lose, but what we become. Each time we give in to anger, we strengthen its grip. We train the mind to believe this is the way: shout, strike, retaliate. Slowly, we build a prison of habit until we are no longer free. The Buddha taught that to live in anger is to live in chains, and every outburst tightens those chains around the heart. Yet here is the truth. One outburst may destroy much, but one breath of patience can save even more. There's a story of a monk insulted on the road. The man who insulted him expected fury in return, but the monk only smiled and said, "Thank you, my friend, for reminding me to practice patience." That moment could have ended in anger, perhaps even violence. Instead, it ended in peace. No regret followed, only calm. This shows us something vital. The cost of anger is high, but the reward of patience is even higher. So let us reflect. What is the cost of our last outburst? Did it bring peace or did it carve regret? Did it build or did it break? We cannot undo what is done, but we can learn. We can remember that every moment of anger comes with a price tag, one far heavier than we imagine in the heat of the moment. And knowing this, perhaps next time we will pause. Perhaps next time, instead of letting fire consume us, we will choose silence, patience, compassion. Because one outburst can cost a lifetime of peace, but one moment of restraint can save it. History is not written only in ink. It is often written in fire. And behind many of humanity's darkest pages lies a spark of anger that was allowed to burn unchecked. Consider the legend of Achilles from Greek mythology. A warrior unmatched in strength, yet it was not his enemies who destroyed him. It was his rage. When his pride was wounded, when anger consumed his heart, he abandoned reason. His fury on the battlefield became infamous, but it also led to reckless choices, needless deaths, and ultimately his own downfall. One man's wrath altered the course of an entire war. Now shift to real history. Think of Julius Caesar. The Roman world was already unstable, yet anger among senators, anger at his power, at their own fading influence, erupted into violence. They struck him down in fury, believing they were saving the Republic. But their outburst did not save Rome. Instead, it plunged the empire into civil war, paving the way for an emperor far more absolute than Caesar ever was. And what of Genghis Khan? His rise was not fueled only by ambition, but by vengeance. A rival clan humiliated him, killed his family, and cast him aside. His anger became a fire he carried for life. That fire forged one of the largest empires in history. But at the cost of rivers of blood, countless cities reduced to ash, entire cultures erased. Anger built his empire, yes, but anger also drowned it in cruelty. Even in modern times, the echoes remain. World leaders have unleashed wars not from wisdom, but from wounded pride. A single insult, a single provocation, and armies march. Think of how many lives are lost because one man's temper was too quick, one nation's pride too fragile. But not only empires fall to anger. Sometimes it is the small moments that ripple outward, shaping history in ways unseen. There was once a general during the American Civil War who lost his temper during a crucial moment in battle. His rash decision, made in fury, cost thousands of lives and shifted the outcome of that day. Anger didn't just kill, it changed the course of a nation. And yet, if anger has the power to change history, so too does its opposite. Think of Mahatma Gandhi. He was insulted, beaten, imprisoned. Every provocation could have sparked fury. Yet he chose calm, he chose nonviolence. His refusal to let anger rule him changed the destiny of a nation. Or Martin Luther King Jr., standing before crowds filled with pain and rage. He could have stoked their anger, could have called for vengeance. Instead, he spoke of dreams, not hatred. His restraint turned fury into hope and hope into change. History reminds us, anger may write its name in blood, but patience and compassion can carve theirs in stone. The Buddha warned that anger spreads like wildfire. One flame can consume a forest. One man's wrath can consume a world. We see this truth in every war, every uprising, every family feud that spirals into generations of bitterness. But he also taught that a single drop of compassion can quench a raging fire. And just as history remembers the destruction wrought by anger, it also remembers the healing born of peace. So here lies the question. If history itself can be altered by a single outburst, what about the history of your own life? What legacy will your moments of anger write? When we realize that our words and actions ripple outward, touching children, friends, communities, we begin to see that anger is never just ours. It shapes the future. Anger rarely appears out of nowhere. It's not lightning striking a clear sky. It's smoke before fire, a whisper before a roar. The problem is, most of us only notice anger after it has already taken over. By then, the fire is raging and we are no longer in control. But if we can learn to see the sparks before they become flames, we hold the power to stop destruction before it begins. So what are the signs? It begins in the body. The Buddha often taught us to return to our breath because the breath reveals the state of the mind. Notice this. When irritation arises, your breath shortens. It grows shallow, quick, uneasy. Your chest feels tight. Then comes the heartbeat, louder, faster. Your jaw tenses, your shoulders stiffen. Some people clench their fists without realizing. Others feel heat in the face, a flush rushing to the cheeks. These are the first sparks. The mind, too, shifts. Thoughts grow sharp, like knives searching for a target. Every word, every action of the other person suddenly feels exaggerated, intolerable. You replay their offense in your head again and again, fueling the fire with each repetition. These are the whispers of anger, and if we can hear them early, we can choose differently. There is a story from Zen tradition. A monk asked his master, "How do I conquer anger?" The master replied, "First, see it coming. Then you need not conquer it at all." The wisdom is simple but profound. Anger is hardest to control when it is already roaring, but when it is still a spark, when it is only tension in the breath, only heat in the chest, it can be softened, calmed, released. So how do we recognize these sparks in daily life? Start by watching the small irritations. The long line at the grocery store, the car that cuts you off in traffic, the child who asks the same question for the 10th time. These are the seeds of bigger anger. If we cannot recognize irritation here, we will not recognize rage later. Mindfulness is the lamp we carry. When we train ourselves to notice even the smallest stirrings of discomfort, we train ourselves to see the first signs of anger. But recognition alone is not enough. We must also be honest with ourselves. Too often we disguise anger under other names. We say we are just tired, just stressed, just annoyed. But underneath, the fire is already smoldering. By naming anger for what it is, we take away some of its power. The Buddha taught that when a strong emotion arises, we should greet it like an old friend. "Hello, my anger, I see you are here." This simple acknowledgement transforms anger from master into guest. We no longer fight it, we simply recognize it, and in doing so, we regain control. And why does this matter so deeply? Because once anger has erupted, regret is nearly inevitable. But if we see it before it rises, we can choose patience instead of pain, silence instead of sharp words, compassion instead of cruelty. Imagine how many arguments could be prevented if we noticed the tension in our bodies before the shouting began. How many relationships could be saved if we recognized the trembling of the breath before the first insult escaped our lips? Recognizing anger is like noticing a storm on the horizon. You may not stop the clouds from forming, but you can prepare. You can bring shelter. You can light a candle. You can keep yourself and others safe. Anger is fire. Compassion is water. One burns, the other heals. And when fire meets water, the blaze quiets, the earth cools, and life can grow again. The Buddha never told us simply to suppress anger, for suppression only buries it deeper where it smolders and waits. Instead, he taught us to transform it, to take that energy, that intensity, and turn it into something luminous, compassion. But how? How do we transform rage into love? It begins with perspective. When someone offends us, our first thought is, they are against me, they are my enemy. But pause and look deeper. Behind anger often lies suffering. The one who lashes out is often carrying pain of their own. The insult they throw at you may be the echo of a wound they've never healed. When we see this, something shifts. The fire of anger softens into understanding. Compassion blooms where fury once ruled. There is a powerful story from the Buddha's life. Once, a man approached him, furious, shouting insults in the marketplace. The Buddha stood calmly, listening without anger. When the man stopped, expecting retaliation, the Buddha simply asked, "If someone gives you a gift and you do not accept it, who does the gift belong to?" The man replied, "It remains with the giver." The Buddha smiled gently. "Then so it is with your anger. I do not accept it. It remains with you." But here lies the deeper lesson. The Buddha did not hate the man for insulting him. He saw him with compassion, understanding that such anger came from ignorance and suffering. Instead of reflecting fire, he offered coolness. We can practice the same. When anger arises within us, we can pause and ask, what pain lies behind this anger, mine or theirs? A child disobeys not to wound us, but because they are still learning. A partner snaps, not because they wish to hurt, but because they are tired, burdened. A stranger is rude, not because we deserve it, but because their day may be filled with silent struggles. When we see suffering instead of offense, compassion becomes the natural response. But compassion does not mean weakness. It does not mean letting harm continue. Rather, it means responding with clarity instead of cruelty. It means choosing words that heal instead of words that scar. In Buddhist practice, one method is metta, loving-kindness meditation. When anger arises, instead of feeding it, we silently wish, "May I be free from anger. May they be free from suffering. May we both find peace." This simple practice is like pouring water onto flames. The fire cannot last long when drenched in compassion. And there is another secret. Anger carries energy, tremendous energy. If we simply try to push it down, it harms us. But if we transform it, that same energy becomes fuel for understanding, courage, and love. Think of the great leaders who changed the world not through rage, but through compassion. Their power was not in how loudly they shouted, but in how deeply they cared. They took the world's anger and turned it into a movement of healing. So the next time anger rises, remember this, you hold a choice. To throw the fire and burn, or to pour water and heal. Ask yourself, do I want regret or do I want peace? Do I want scars or do I want healing? Because every moment of anger carries within it the seed of compassion. And when we choose to water that seed, we do not just cool our own fire. We bring shade to others standing in the heat. Patience, a word so simple yet a practice so rare. Many think of patience as weakness, an inability to fight back, a sign of submission. But in truth, patience is not the absence of strength. It is strength perfected. It is the ability to remain unshaken in the storm, the calm in the midst of fire. The Buddha once said, patience is the highest ascetic practice. Why? Because to restrain anger requires more courage than to release it. To lash out is easy. To remain still, to breathe. To respond with clarity, that is mastery. Think of the mountain. The winds howl, storms batter its slopes, yet it remains unmoved. This is patience. It does not mean the mountain is unaware of the storm. It means the storm cannot uproot it. When we practice patience, we become like that mountain. Life will provoke us, people will test us, difficulties will rise like tempests. But patience holds us steady, unbroken, unburned. There is a story of a farmer whose ox was stolen. Enraged, he searched for the thief, vowing revenge. But when he met a monk along the road, the monk asked, "If you chase with anger, what will you find?" The farmer stopped. He realized that his fury only added to his loss. The ox was gone, but his peace did not have to be. He breathed, released his anger, and returned home lighter than before. Patience had restored more than an ox ever could. It restored himself. Patience does not mean doing nothing. It means choosing the right moment, the right response, the right heart. It gives space for wisdom to arise where anger would only destroy. A patient word can turn away wrath. A patient pause can prevent regret. A patient heart can heal wounds that anger would deepen. Science even shows us the power of patience. Those who cultivate it through mindfulness, meditation, or simple awareness suffer less stress, enjoy stronger relationships, and live longer, healthier lives. What the Buddha taught as a spiritual truth, modern research now confirms as a practical reality. But patience is more than a tool for peace. It is a mirror of compassion. When we are patient with others, we acknowledge their struggles, their humanity, their imperfections. We see that they, like us, stumble, falter, and sometimes fail. And instead of punishing them with our anger, we offer them the space to grow. And when we are patient with ourselves, we soften the harsh voice inside. We stop burning ourselves for every mistake, every flaw. We learn that growth takes time, healing takes time, and wisdom takes time. Patience, then, is not just endurance. It is love stretched across time. The strength of patience is quiet, but it is unshakable. Empires have fallen because of anger, but patience has built families, communities, and nations. When we live with patience, we do more than avoid regret. We plant seeds of harmony, seeds that bloom long after the heat of the moment has passed. One moment of anger, 1,000 moments of regret. But one moment of compassion, 1,000 moments of peace. This is the truth we've uncovered on our journey. Anger is fast, sudden as lightning, fierce as fire, but compassion is timeless, enduring like the earth beneath our feet. Anger leaves scars, compassion leaves blessings. When we look back at our lives, what do we remember most? It is rarely the victories won in anger. More often, it is the kindness we showed, the patience we offered, the love we gave even when it was hardest. A gentle word that calmed a storm, a pause that prevented regret, a smile that turned away hostility. These are the choices that echo across years, choices that bring no shame, only quiet pride. The Buddha taught that holding on to anger is like grasping a burning coal with the intent to harm another. You are the one who is burned first. But when we release anger, when we replace it with compassion, we are free. Free from regret, free from chains, free to live each moment fully without the shadow of yesterday's fury. Think of your life not as a series of battles to be won, but as a garden to be tended. Each moment of patience is a seed, each act of compassion a drop of water. With time, the garden flourishes. And the more we choose peace, the more peace blooms, not just in our own hearts, but in the hearts of those around us. Because compassion is contagious. Just as anger spreads like wildfire, compassion spreads like sunlight, quietly, steadily, bringing warmth to everything it touches. So here lies the question, simple but profound. What legacy do you wish to leave behind? A trail of regrets or a path of peace? Moments of fire or moments of light? The choice in the end is always ours. Anger will knock at your door again, of that there is no doubt. Life will test you, people will provoke you, difficulties will rise. But when the flame flickers, remember this: within you lies the power to transform. You can choose to feed the fire, or you can choose to pour water. You can choose regret, or you can choose peace. And perhaps when your life is done, you will not be remembered for your outbursts, but for your compassion. Not for your anger, but for your patience. Not for the scars you left, but for the healing you gave. If these words have touched something within you, if they reminded you of the power of patience, of compassion, of peace, then let this journey continue. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where we walk together through the teachings of the Buddha, not as ancient lessons locked in time, but as living wisdom for our daily lives. Here, every video is an invitation to breathe more deeply, to live more gently, and to see more clearly. So if your heart longs for peace, if your spirit seeks understanding, I invite you, join us. Let us choose compassion over anger, wisdom over regret, and walk this path of awakening together. Because peace is not only possible, it is already here, waiting within you.